Legs & Co. Written by Ali Crockett and David Scott. Read by David Baddiel.
Hello, I'm David, and I'm going to tell you a story about a man with hopes and dreams of creating the next big thing. Tim Tyson looked up from the workbench in his shed and saw the red light flashing. It was Mum, again. The buzzer was one of Tim's inventions, one of his many inventions. But after half a lifetime of tinkering, none of his creations had ever taken off. Tim lived the lonely life of a retrosexual, middle-aged man with a taste for Jeremy Corbyn's chic. It went again, like a dubstep wasp. He'd installed the buzzer so that his elderly mum would be able to call him in case of an emergency. He jogged up the garden path, back to their tumble-down, leaky house. "Tea!" she shrieked from upstairs. "Get me another cup, you useless git!" Ah, dear old Mum. He couldn't blame her for being a bit short with him. She was all set to become a world-famous ballerina, but then Tim came along and ended her career. "And don't squeeze the bag, or I'll squeeze yours!" One of Mum's little jokes. There was no thank you when Tim brought his mum the cuppa. She was too engrossed in her favourite TV show, Dragon's Den. There they were, 5 big shots, man spreading themselves across the screen. "Yuck!" she shouted from the top of the stairs. "You've used one of your Nancy Boy herbal bags!" As Tim's mum threw the cup, she lost balance, slipped on the landing carpet, and spine surfed all the way to the bottom. Crunch, 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 like a human bag of kettle chips. Tim blamed himself for the accident. It was true, he had slipped his mum a Red Bush. Less caffeine might put her in a better mood, he thought. In fact, it had put her in a wheelchair. And now, without the use of her legs, her mood was even worse. Ridden with guilt, for months on end, day and night, he welded, tinkered, and programmed. Finally, he emerged and proudly took his latest invention to show his mum. "What's that bunch of hot mess, you clown tard?" she squawked. That hot mess was a pair of exoskeleton robo-legs, ingeniously built from parts of an old washing machine, a remote control, and a really cheesed-off Roomba. Tim attached the jumble of pistons and cables to the immobile legs of his complaining mum. He took a breath and pressed a button on the remote. His mum's legs suddenly sprang to life, catching Tim full square in the groin. She got up out of her wheelchair and lurched around the room mechanically. "Oh, they work! Well done," she said as she stepped over her son, lying on the floor, cupping himself in agony. "She likes them." Tim was delighted, despite the intense ball ache. "Thanks, Mum. I love it." "Shh," she said as she slumped back into her easy chair. "I'm watching the Den." At least Mum's got her independence back, Tim thought, as she put her feet up on his back and puffed away on her cronut-flavoured vaping rig. "I've done it. Finally, I've created something useful. If my invention can change Mum's life for the better, maybe I could change the lives of millions of disabled," he thought. But over the following months, no one else agreed. Not Bill Gates, not Elon Musk, not Gavin from the King's Head. Desperate for investment, Tim found himself standing in a TV studio in front of his 5 sneering capitalists. He swallowed his disgust and pitched Walkables, his leg enhancement technology. He spluttered and brain-farted his way through a plan for a non-profit company that would sell the Walkables at the lowest possible price to people who didn't have use of their legs. Despite PR training in how to appear human, the 5 business people were finding it hard to look interested. "Now, I'd like you to meet the inspiration for my innovation," said Tim, as his mum squeaked into the room in her wheelchair. She'd only been willing to join his pitch if it meant meeting her TV heroes, and now, for once, she was silent. Tim wept a tear as he recounted a slightly sexed-up version of his mum's tragic accident. The toddler, the bus, the 70-year-old's selfless leap into the road. Not a flicker from the Dragons. So Tim switched on his mum's prototype Walkables. In an instant, she was up, out of her wheelchair and juddering around the room. This produced a few raised eyebrows, but he realised the dragons were looking for some next-level SH1T. So Tim took out the remote control and pressed a button that switched his mother's walkables into demo mode. Suddenly, she sprang into life and started performing a not entirely consented to river dance routine. The patronising plutocrats were entranced. It was incredible. The old girl was high-kicking all around the room, feet everywhere. But when the hysteria died down, each dragon, in turn, passed on Tim's invention. His not-for-profit idea was not for them. All except the quiet lady dragon on the end. "Hello, Tim. I'm Helen. I've been waiting for an opportunity like this for absolutely ages. This isn't about profit. This is about changing people's lives." Yes, yes, yes. And by the way, whoa, thought Tim. It had been a long time since he'd spoken to a woman who hadn't given birth to him. "And you know what else, Tim? I reckon with the right sponsorship, we don't need to sell walkables. We can give them away." For a social justice warrior like Tim, this was music to his hair-sprouting ears. Tim cut a deal. Charmed by Helen, his demand of £1 million in exchange for 5% soon became £10 in exchange for 95%. But he was thrilled. Within a few months, Tim's invention had been fine-tuned and put into production. As Helen had promised, with all the major retailers on board, a free set of walkables were posted to every wheelchair-bound person in Britain. Tim was fated as a hero to the disabled, like Jesus crossed with Prince Harry, plus another Jesus on top. Furthermore, having worked so closely together, Tim and Helen's relationship was taking a shed-shaking turn. One evening, at the bottom of Tim's garden, in the afterglow of some pretty heavy mentoring, Helen suggested a new idea. Walkables had done their job for the disabled. Now, they should be made available to the general public. With the retailer still on board, they could be sold at a bargain price as a sports accessory to aid recovery after intense exercise. They'd make millions. This isn't what I envisioned for my baby, Tim explained, and I'm not really interested in money. Helen was utterly confused. "Think it over carefully," she said, and left him all alone. With thoughts of Helen's plan on his mind and her gym-toned body, he spent the next day in his shed sorting out his wood. He was getting just a little bit tired of his mum's constant demands. He found her on the floor by the TV. "I can't move!" she screeched dramatically. "I can't move!" And she pointed to a damp patch on the ceiling with an accusatory finger. A leak from the roof must have come through and short-circuited her walkables, realised Tim. He soon had her back on her bionic feet. "What I feel towards you, son, well, it borders on pride. Very nearly," she gushed. It had been a terrifying near miss. How had he let this happen to his mum? He'd neglected their house for too long. Perhaps a bit of money would be useful. Tim went straight over to Helen HQ and signed up to her new plan. Within a few weeks, walkables went on sale to the mass market. Soon, the money started rolling in, and to his mum's delight, Tim moved them into a huge mansion filled with servants for her to walk all over. Walkables were proving to be a massive hit, but Tim noticed that his baby was far from being used for recovery after intense exercise. Walkables were being bought by every lazy git in the country to get as far away from intense exercise as possible. The streets were filled with robot-legged fatbergs, barging people out of the way as they galumphed between Greggs, Betfred and Weatherspoons. One evening, waiting for Helen to reply to a bunch of unanswered texts, Tim switched on the news. A report claimed that walkables across the country were taking their owners on unplanned trips to the shops. Cubicle jockeys were walking out of their telesales jobs to visit Apple stores. Stay-at-home mums were leaving home to pop into McDonald's. Minicab drivers were being taken for a ride around their local Sainsbury's. His mum hastily switched over the channel, but the penny had already dropped for Tim. This is why Helen was able to sell walkables at such a knockdown price. The sponsorship from the retailers came at a cost. People were being taken on involuntary trips to their very own shops. Once walkable users were under their roofs, they were a soft touch for an impulse purchase. Tim hot-footed it round to Helen HQ. In the top-floor boardroom, he demanded that control of the walkables be given back to the people. The country's being turned into a bunch of mindless consumer drones, he spouted. Helen Trout pouted at him condescendingly. She explained. Walkables were the cure for the death of the high street. For most users, it was a small inconvenience if it meant they had a knockdown pair of robo-pegs. As Tim looked around, his eyes landed on the remote control from his den pitch on display in the boardroom like some sort of corporate trophy. He'd sold out, and Helen was refusing to give him a refund. "What about us?" he begged. "What us?" Helen shrugged. Of course, this explained why she had gone cold ever since he'd signed the new contract. It had been her plan all along, all through their shed love. With only 5% ownership, Tim could do nothing, as Helen had him booted out of the building by security guards wearing his very own invention. Tim went back to his mansion and to the shed he'd had moved there plank by plank. He felt crushed. He felt lonely. Went the buzzer as he finished writing his suicide note. Okay, one last act of kindness for Mum before I end it all. Tim entered the house to find his mum, his rock, hopping about on one leg on top of an unconscious butler. "This little oik gave me the wrong kind of caviar. I started kicking him, and then this happened. Fix them, will you, you lovely son of mine?" His mum, too cranky to change, insisted on using her prototype walkables, and now they were malfunctioning. Figuring that it was a problem with the firmware, Tim plugged into a phablet and started tapping away. While tinkering with the code, Tim came across a back door he'd left in the original software that would be accessible in every pair of walkables in the country. A plan came into his mind. "With a bit of work, Mum, I can override Helen and put an end to this despicable business." You don't want to do that, son. You might get into trouble." But Tim was already back in his shed. His suicide note cast aside, he was now working away, bashing out code like a programmer with 4 arms. When Tim was finished, he had a new invention, an app with which he could control every single pair of walkables in Britain. Went the buzzer. But Tim was out on the street, phablet in hands. With the swipe of a finger, thousands of walkable wearers all across the country stopped what they were doing and started to form an unwilling army. Like a beige-scale Wat Tyler, Tim led them on a riot of destruction, smashing up the storefronts of Walkable's corporate sponsors. Tim had click-started a revolution. Finally, he had his goose-stepping freedom fighters converge with him at Helen HQ. All of human life was there. Lolling narcoleptics, hairdressers mid-cut, vicars still carrying babies to be christened. It was an extraordinary spectacle, half fun run, half end of days. With a few swipes of the finger, his leggy conscripts surged in through the front doors of Helen HQ and proceeded to roundhouse, back heel, leg drop, toe punt and shin kick the heck out of the place. In the midst of the joyful destruction, Tim heard a chirpy ping. It was a Snapchat from Helen. So maybe it hadn't all been an act in the shed. However, instead of some side boob, or executive underbun, Tim saw an image of his mum, tied up and gagged. "Stop your army, Tim, and meet me in the boardroom." Tim raced up to the boardroom, where he found Helen waiting, gun in hand, pointing at his mum's head. "Throw me your phablet, or your mother gets it." Tim may have sold his soul, but he wasn't going to sell out on his mum. He threw the phablet at her feet, and Helen smashed the screen with her stiletto. Freed from the control of Tim's app, his leg army drifted off back to their homes. I can't have any loose ends. Helen now trained the gun on Tim and explained that the next morning the police would find him dead in his shed, having taken his own life. She held up a suicide note that looked strangely familiar. "But how?" he gaped. His mum shook off the ropes pretending to bind her, tore back the gaffer tape and stuck her vape stick in her mouth. "Oh, I am gasping," she said. "Mum, you betrayed me?" "Yeah, I've been working with Helen ever since the den. I can't move. Oh, you fell for all that, didn't you?" No. His own mum was more ruthless than Helen and all the dragons combined. We had it all, Timbo, but you were going to throw it all away. "You've ruined my life once, I'm not having you ruin it again," she mum-splained and exhaled a plume of nicotine puff. Finding the cronut-scented cloud overpowering, Helen gagged. Tim spotted his chance. He jumped forwards and knocked the gun from her hands. They scrapped and they scuffled, but Tim's shed-toned body was no match for Helen. She pushed him to the floor and kicked him in all his favourite places to not be kicked. Bleeding, Tim crawled across the carpet to get away. Helen retrieved the gun and pointed it once again at Tim. "If you won't go quietly, we'll just have to do it here." So this is it, thought Tim. I'm done. Tim had always had such high hopes for his brains, but now all they were going to achieve was a nasty stain on a corporate carpet. Then his eyes once again landed on the remote from his Dragon's Den pitch, still on display. He suddenly had an idea. Like a turpentine leopard, he reached up, grabbed it, and hit the demo button. His mum, who had been cowering behind a chair, suddenly leapt up into the air, her walkables once more under the spell of the river dance routine. She pirouetted over to Helen and kicked the gun out of the dragon's hand. Tim rolled under the table for his own protection. His mum was giving Helen an Irish jig right in the face. She reeled back against the boardroom's big window. And then came the showstopper. Michael Flatley, eat your heart out. Helen went straight through the plate glass and fell 20 stories to the street below. She was dead. And so was Tim's walking nightmare. Still in control of the remote, Tim jumped on his mum's shoulders and legged it back to their mansion before anyone noticed. The next morning, when the police found Helen's body, everyone concluded that she had thrown herself out of the window in the face of a nationwide walkable malfunction. The product recall would be a clusterfudge of Volkswagen proportions. When all the fuss had died down, Tim moved himself and his mum back into their old family house. It had been a learning experience for them both. While his mum discovered a strong dislike of impromptu Irish dancing, Tim had found his mojo. He gave up tinkering in the shed and threw himself into tinkering on Tinder instead. It was time, he felt, to release his inner Tim on the like-minded ladies of the internet. It was thirsty work doing all that judging and swiping, but he was never short of a refreshing cup of Red Bush tea. Tim's mum, still strapped into her walkables, looked up and saw the red light flashing. It was her son. What did he want now?
You have been listening to the Crackanory collection, presented by Audible.